Hello and welcome to Spirit Circle. It's our first interview of Spirit Circle as well. I think it's it's quite apt that our first guest is Andrew Johnson. He was our first guest in Unite Planet, our other venture, and so it's only right that he should be our first guest for this one as well. And it's great to welcome him back. So how are you, Andrew?
I'm all right, thanks, Johnny. How are you doing?
All good. Yeah, all good here.
Good. Nice to see
Um,
you all again.
Yeah, it's great to get another thing going, something because
Mm.
we've been out of action for a few years now, so we feel ready to come back in again.
Mm.
So it's great to have you on.
Thanks
Thank
for
you for being
inviting
our
me.
first guest as well, and we're going to discuss your new book that come out. When did it come out?
It's basically the end of March. Yeah, just towards the end of March, so about two weeks ago, really.
Yeah, I mean, I've ordered it, so it's yet to come, but I've started reading the PDF version. It's called
Yep.
Exploring Consciousness, Expanding Reality. There's a lot to
Yep.
cover. Um, because
Yep.
just by glancing over the contents, I see that there's so many areas that
Mm.
is worth exploring with this. So, I suppose the first question is, how did you get into these topics to bring you to writing the book?
Well, I think it's just to me, it's like a natural development of looking at all the other topics that you and I have spoken about over the
Mm,
years. You know, I mean, I suppose primarily. Um, I think one of the things where I first started getting into some of the concepts was through looking at UFOs and alien stuff. And one of the big factors in that was this character, I'm sure we've spoken about him on previous Unite Planets, is Wilbert Smith, who
yes,
was
yeah.
this radio engineer who looked into the ET and UFO issue. And then he starts talking about metaphysics and consciousness, and that's where he ended up. And so that I've kind of followed a similar path. Um, and bringing in 9/11 as well. I do mention 9/11 a few times in the book
Mm,
because, of course, you and Paul have spoken about that many times in the
yeah.
past, and it is one of the sort of key areas really. Um, and so it's like the consciousness, I think, is where all these topics sort of bring you.
Mm,
And I think in if you read the introduction, I talk about it being a journey, like a spiritual journey,
yeah.
really. And my goal really was to try and bring together concepts from science, religion, spirituality, and if you want to call it the conspiracy world,
Mm,
and sort of integrate those things like psychedelic experiences and um, and find the sort of common threads because like for example Wilbert Smith, he the things that he was talking about sound a lot like Buddhism, although he never mentioned Buddha or
mm,
Buddhism, and I didn't know then much about at all about Buddhism, and I don't know a bit more now. I think we spoke about that in some of our last interviews. Actually, it was when 3 years ago I started to learn a bit more about it, and I haven't turned into a Buddhist or anything. So that and Buddhism has specific things where they mention consciousness. They
mm,
have this concept called store consciousness, and that's they use that word explicitly, and it's not something you hear as much. You don't if you read the Bible or you follow sort of Christian practices. The word consciousness doesn't come up very often.
no.
It's not yet. There is this thing called Christ consciousness. But that's not talked about in Christianity
Mm,
really, or not in the mainstream sort of Anglican or Catholic versions of it. And I came across this other guy through my research into Wilbert Smith, and he talked about Christ consciousness, which is just like this wider awareness of everything, and the cosmos and everything. It's to do with that. I don't think there's an exact definition, although I do give a definition in the book. So it's what I wanted to do was try, and my hope was that people who know a bit about Buddhism might read it and find out about UFOs and aliens,
mm.
and because I mentioned that near the end. Because I think one of the things we talked about was the wing makers.
Oh
We,
yes,
did- we
yes,
you might remember. I think that
yeah.
was probably in the last chat or near the last chat that we did, and I've got a chapter on that in the book. And the wing makers claim to be this sort of race of off-worlders, that are helping humanity evolve. And of course, some people say, "Oh, it's just a story," and somebody's created a website to sell books and CDs and stuff. But when you actually study it, there seems to be a bit more to it than that. And they certainly have advanced spiritual knowledge, or whoever wrote it did put it that way. And so that's in the book. So that, so people that have looked at the Wingmakers, they might read the book and say, "Oh yeah, that's the Wingmakers," and then find out about Buddhism, or write a little bit about Hinduism and near-death experience. So it's that really, I think, is the main goal, is to bring all those topics together and try and put them into an understandable format. And I'm not trying to preach to anyone, although I do obviously have a sort of position of how I think about things. And I did an interview with Richard D. Hall.
Yes, yeah.
That was about just over a month ago, I think. And as he said, I'm basically not ruling anything out. That's really in what I've put in the book.
I think that's it, because I mean, the mainstream overview of consciousness, I mean, they don't really delve into that much, do they, really? Like the material reductionists and everything like that. But I mean, we were discussing before you came on how the topic of consciousness in science, in even mainstream science, is gaining, especially because at the moment the overview of it is that consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain, and that's pretty much it. They don't really go any further than that. But there are growing studies creeping now into mainstream that are questioning that. And do you sense a change happening? Do you sense that?
A little bit. I mean, I think it's from what I've seen and some of what I put in the book. I mean, one of the key speakers in the science community is Roger Penrose. He put together this enormous 900-page book, and they're obviously repeatedly talking about things like quantum physics and the relationship, or how you might be able to explain consciousness through quantum physics. The book that they've written is called Consciousness and the Universe: Quantum Physics, Evolution, Brain and Mind. And I don't quote much from that book. But what, like, for example, that to take Roger Penrose, and I think it's Stuart Hameroff, I think is the other guy. Stuart Hameroff is a neurologist, I think. I think he does brain surgery, I think. I could have got that wrong, but he's an MD, Stuart Hameroff. And so they've looked at that things that they've found in the structure of the brain, and they talk about these things called microtubules. So these microtubules are some type of structure or postulated structure within the cells of the brain, and they reckon that this is where there might be quantum effects manifesting, and that's how quantum effects actually could explain parts of consciousness or parts of how the human brain can interlink with something else that's non-local. And I think quite a bit of the book explores those sorts of areas. Whether they, for example, try to explain why psychedelic drugs have the effects that they have, I can't remember. There might be something on psychedelic drugs in the book. But that, if you're looking at a really sort of purely science-oriented book, mine might not be the one to go for. That would be this 900-page one. That's just like a mega tome. And I did read, I think I've read about half of that book. I didn't get through all of it. But there is one interesting story in that book whereby one guy started to study consciousness because when he was very young, when he was about I think like 5, 6, 7, he had memories of being in someone else and another life. And he was playing on the beach somewhere, and then he saw this giant. He saw all the water receding, and the beach went dry, and then all this water was coming towards him, and it was a tidal wave, a tsunami, and he was drowned. And that was in his former life, and he remembers that distinctly, and he writes about that as in the start of this chapter, and then he goes on to explore how he could possibly have come to have that memory from a scientific perspective, and I think you look for other cases like that. And that, I think that particular case is mentioned in another book, and And there are a few things that I found out in researching the book, because I was looking at like near-death experience, of course. That's one of the chapters. But the other thing that I looked at was this idea of past lives. And there's a lot of work being done with children that report past life memories. And it's Jim Tucker, Professor Jim Tucker. I think he's recently retired within the last couple of years. And he's written 2 books. One's called Life Before Life, and I think one's called Return to Life. And I recommend those are really good read as well. A very easy read, very sort of simple sort of style and that, and and he's like a child psychologist, I think. So in his studies, he'd come across children that had reported being somebody else, and their parents find this quite disconcerting, and they have this other dad or the mum or whatever. And in one of his books, that child remembering being killed by a tsunami, his story is reported. I don't think he's named in that book, but there are some extraordinary stories in that book.
I mean, they say children are very susceptible, aren't they, to things out, that's related to consciousness and outside realities and things. They're able to.
That's right.
To view things beyond the veneer more than adulthood. It's almost like as we grow older, we lose that a bit. Maybe that's what I've read. Sometimes that can happen. The children are just because they've not come into this world that long. There's still aspects of it where they can channel things outside of our consensual reality.
We might have even said this in one of the other interviews before, but it's worth repeating that in certainly in the UK, if you write a letter to somebody that's a young person, a young boy, say under the age of about 12, you might address them as Master Sinclair or Master Johnson. And it's one of those things, isn't it? You must have heard that.
Oh yeah.
It's like a little thing to make them feel important, but maybe there's a bit more to it than that. And when you say master, it means they're master of their own soul, their own mind, because they haven't been filled with all the cultural, furniture that they pick up along the way and all the rules and everything. They just want to play and enjoy the world and live in the present moment. That's another thing that is said in Buddhism, that you should live in the present moment. That's where you can find yourself. So, before the age of 12, and this is when typically if children have had past life memories, they'd usually all gone by the age of about 9, 10, 12. And one of the famous cases, I did a presentation. The ideas that I'm talking about originally kind of coalesced into this presentation, which I called, the same title as the book, which I did in like 2010, it was years ago, 15 years ago. And so I do all of my books, essentially, they've done as a PowerPoint initially for a presentation, and then I've gone back to that PowerPoint and then basically made them into a book. And that's just, I don't know, where my brain works or something. Same with this one. But anyway, so in that presentation, you can find that. I've got it on my website and everything, and you can find this story elsewhere. There's one of the most famous children with past life memories is James Leininger. And he went from a young age, I think this happened in about 2002, 2003. He was about 3 years old then, I think, 4 years old. He had relived being in a plane crash, and he was trying to get out of this plane crash, and his parents were saying, "Why are you so obsessed with planes?" As of, I'm trapped in this plane, And he recounted this story of being shot down. Oh. And over time, more of it came out. More of the story came out. And they said, "Well, where were you shot down?" "Over the sea." He says, "Well, where did you fly your plane from?" "Or from a ship called the Natoma, the USS Natoma." And his dad researched into this, and this happened over like several years. And he was able to give specific details, and he was able to name other crew members.
He was saying, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And that's what he was repeating over and over. "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out."
I had to respond. So I started to ask him some questions. "What happened to your plane?" "It got shot." "Well, who shot your plane?" "The Japanese." So I kept going. I said, well, where did your plane come from? And he said, a boat. Did your boat have a name? And he said, yes, Natoma. Here was this history of USS Natoma Bay, CVE 62. This ship supported the Battle of Iwo Jima.
It was, what can you say?
It was a complete mystery. Where could he have gotten that information? How could he say something like that? I had a hard time believing it.
I remember one time where James was talking about his airplane, and Bruce had asked him, do you remember what kind of plane you flew? And he said it was a Corsair.
The Corsair was fast, agility was very good.
One day James and we were talking. I said, I know you have those nightmares all the time. Who's the little man? Do you remember what your name was? And he said James. And I said, do you remember what your last name was? And he said, mm-mm.
I found a list of men that had been killed serving on World War II aircraft carriers. I went through the list and found the names of 18 men that had been killed aboard Natoma Bay. It was really startling and almost scary. There was one guy killed during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and his name is James M. Houston, Jr.
I remember Bruce on the phone reading this to me, and he said James M. Houston Jr. was the only pilot from the Natoma Bay who had been killed in the battle for Iwo Jima. I know it. It's him.
James M. Houston Jr., before he was assigned to Natoma Bay, was in a Navy squadron that flew Corsairs. Shortly after Andrea found James M. Houston Jr.'s sister, Ann Barron, we had the opportunity to visit with her. We felt it was important, and we felt something important would happen. For me, I had this thing in my head, well, maybe this will close the loop.
She said that the information was really shocking and surprising, but that she believed.
Knowing my name and things that my brother did when he was a kid, it's too amazing to describe. I think it's probably a reincarnation of my brother.
And then they eventually wrote a book called Soul Survivor, and it's the story of James Leininger. And yeah, so he reported being on this ship, and then he reported that that one of the other people on the ship was Fred Meinwald or Meinwald, and all these names checked out. They checked them all out, and they even found this Fred Meinwald guy, and they recognized, in fact they went to a reunion event of the USS Natoma, and he was able to name and recognize other crew members from his previous life. Wow. And they went out and they actually went out and had a ceremony at sea for the original James, who was called James Huston. They found his name, and they did a closure where they went out to sail to where he was shot down and threw some flowers in the water. And so that and then it kind of like that ended it all for him. He got closure. But before that, they even found James Huston's sister, and as a 10-year-old boy, however old he was, that his parents went with him to this sister who I think was called, I can't remember her name. I think they had another sister called Annie, but he knew that she had another sister, and then he also knew that she had this painting that I think her uncle or another family relative had done, and she brought it down and she verified that she had this painting of her as a child. And so this little kid, knew that she had this painting stashed away in the loft, and then. And then he said, what did you do with the other one? Because there were apparently two copies of this painting, and one had gone to another relative in the family sort of thing, And she said she didn't want to give it away or something. So he knew this whole story, And there's loads of details like that, and they all checked out. All of them checked out. And then the other thing, which is in the Jim Tucker book, which wasn't in the TV broadcast, was that... the father said to the son, he said one day, look, I'm really glad, that you're my son, and I'm so glad that, of that. And he says, well, I knew that would be the case because that's why I picked you as parents. And he says, well, what do you mean? He says, well, I saw you. And I says, what do you mean you saw us? Well, I saw you at the Pink Hotel in Hawaii before I was born. Wow. And it was true. They went to the Pink Hotel shortly, and that might have even been where he was conceived, and he knew they'd been there before he was born, and he'd never told them. They'd never said that to him. And there's other stories in the Jim Tucker book as well about these children. So it was intriguing that this was between life. You hear a lot of stories about past life memories, but clearly the boy was disembodied at that point. He wasn't in a body. He wasn't in a fetus or a baby or anything. And there are a couple of other cases in the book like that as well. And I never really heard about that before, not that have been verified like that. There's another story in Jim Tucker's book, a bit like that, where I think one child wanted to incarnate with certain parents, and then he tried to get into the womb of the mother, but there was another baby already in there. So he had to go to the mother's sister, who was also pregnant at the time, and he was born to that mother. And then they had this, when they were about 3 years old as toddlers, there was a big argument broke out. And one of the cousins said to the other, well, I had to go with my mum because your mum wouldn't let me in, And like I can't remember the exact facts around this, but apparently this he tried to get into the womb, and there was something that where this woman was going to have an abortion, and the kid knew that she was going to have an abortion, and the circumstances under which this had happened. It's just completely bizarre, But it was all verified that that's actually what happened, It wasn't just hearsay.
Crazy,
and of course,
isn't it?
Yeah.
It's amazing. And you hear a lot of these things that suggest that something else is happening with our consciousness,
Yeah.
And these have happened through, recorded since the dawn of mankind. This has been
Yeah.
It goes right back then, so it's like we've always known. There's something about within our humanity that we've always known that we're more than this physical body,
That's exactly my point. Yeah, that's exactly what I say in the book. That one of the key things that I hope you can kind of prove by reading either this book or Jim Tucker's book is that you have an element of your being which is separate from your physical body. You can call that under various names, and I'm not particularly. I might use soul and spirit interchangeably in the book. Whereas, if you're a real spiritual practitioner, they define differently. But that's one of the key things. You are not your body.
Yeah.
And there's this saying, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. But the other one that was said, I think there was this Itzhak Bentov. There was a video that somebody posted, and this was after I'd finished the book, and he said, well, you don't have a body as well. Your soul has a body, not the other way around. Your body doesn't have a soul. Your soul has a body temporarily.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's a really good way of putting it. Your soul has a body, not your body has a soul. It's the other way around. We always think of it because we're not encouraged to realize that the soul is eternal. It's not really taught. This idea of being in a body, and there being a God or something, if you've got to mediate your, the way that Christianity generally works in most branches is that when you experience quote unquote God, that experience has got to be taught or mediated through the church and the teachings of the Bible, or whether that be the Old Testament or the New Testament. And so the priest or the preacher or the bishop or whoever it is can put their own spin on things and tell you what to do based on, what their interpretation of God is and what your interpretation of God is. But it's really not like that. It's just not like that at all. In that, we're all sons and daughters of God as I see it. And I think that was really what Jesus' message was, and it just got sort of subverted really by the people who wrote the Gospels and whatnot. And it's all about mystical experience, because that's the thing that's common to all religions is the mystical experience. Where and it's just what you said a few minutes ago is how I interpret that. You get this understanding or this sense or this intuition that you're not your body and you're connected into this greater, and of course we're talking to somebody who's had that experience, Paul's had that experience, and he's written
Absolutely.
that book.
Yeah.
For what are the title of your books? Feet. What's the feet on the ground? I can't remember. Paul.
It's got Walk Up
Walk-
Alive, then feet on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean that happened to you when you were 14, didn't it? I think, wasn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. It was very bizarre, but it woke me up. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
And there's a few, 2 or 3 near-death experiences I recount in the book. Not yours, Paul. So I know you've written a book about that, but I do mention Anita Moorjani's experience. Somebody sent me her book, and that's really unusual because she was like terrified of getting cancer. She writes about that in the book, and then she got cancer, and she started having to have chemotherapy. And then she basically got to the point where all her organs stopped working and she collapsed and she quote unquote died. And then she had this near-death experience. And she, for example, reported knowing that her brother was coming to see her in the hospital and he was coming on a plane. She gave various details about that. And then she came back. I can't remember all the details of the near-death experience off the top of my head. She came back, quote unquote, and then she knew that her cancer would be cured, and it didn't really matter how much chemo drugs they put in her. She knew she was going to make a full recovery, which she did. Oh. And then she spent the last whatever it is, 30 years, telling the world about her experiences. She's got a website and she gives talks and stuff. And
sorry, I was going to say that's quite an interesting story. Because you mentioned that she had the fear of getting cancer, and then she caught cancer, and then she had the near-death experience, and then she was cured, and she had the belief that no matter what she did, she would be cured of cancer. That just in that story itself, it shows how you can manifest literally anything, good or bad.
Absolutely.
And that's quite interesting. It's quite an interesting story. I'm going to look into that a little bit more.
Yeah, do. You can read her book. And I mean, I do a sort of summary of it. And she has, and I think one of the other things that comes out of such experiences, which I mentioned of hers and several others, is that when you're in this other state, you're out of your body. It's a timeless state. Time doesn't exist. Or it's very, very different, and you don't have the same concept of time. And really, that's what we're bound to time in this physical body. It's the two are intimately interwoven. But when you go out of your body, you lose this sense of time, and there are various ways that that's expressed. And I quote Anita Moorjani in that chapter, saying how she describes it. Because then she sort of talks about, well, if you have this idea of reincarnation and you have this life, then another life, and another life. So what she learned in her near-death experience is that time doesn't really exist. So the idea of having a sequence of incarnations kind of from that perspective doesn't make sense. So I think she tries to sort of lead you towards that everything's happening all at once, but we're just tuned in to one part of that, with our own consciousness. So she talks about that. And then I also quote the case of Jenny Cockell. I don't know if that name means anything to anybody. Paul's nodding his head. And Jenny Cockell.
Richard D. Hall. I watched that interview with Richard D. Hall, and it was interesting. Yeah, go ahead, please. Sorry.
No, that's all right. No, because it was on that Strange But True program. That's where I first heard of it. A lot of us that have been looking at this stuff for many years will probably have watched that Michael Aspel program from the mid-90s called Strange But True, and they covered lots of this stuff. They covered UFOs and near-death experience, poltergeist, and all of this. It was a good program, actually, very well done for the main. A few dodgy bits, but in the main, it's really good. So the Jenny Cockell case I heard about on there. She lives in Northampton. I don't know if she still does, but she did then. Married, and she had memories of living in Ireland.
For as long as I can remember, I've had dreams of being Mary in Ireland and dying while the children were still young, not grown, in the 1930s.
These came to her just as daytime visions, dreams, whatever. And these visions came over quite a few years, I think, very broken up, but eventually she was able to piece together a picture. And she had visions of living in this village in Ireland, and she was even able to draw a map. And then she got some local maps, and after a period of time she was able to work out that it was Malahide, north of Dublin. And eventually she went there, and she found out that her name in her past life, which I think, when would that have been? It would have been in the sort of 1930s, I think, was Mary Sutton. And Mary Sutton had, I think, 5 children. And these children, she had an abusive husband who beat her up, basically. And then she fell ill. She went to hospital and she died. And she left the children behind, and she was just absolutely distraught because she knew she wasn't going to be able to look after them. So the eldest child, who was called Sonny, he lived with the father, who was not a nice person, and the other 4 went to an orphanage, and they were sort of separated. And I think at the time that Jenny remembered all of this, we're probably talking sort of 70s, 80s. She was able to track them all down. She tracked down the 4 children from the details that she'd recalled, and having made visits to Malahide. And then she had this particular memory with the eldest where they trapped a hare or a rabbit in a cage, and they'd had to do something with it or release it or something. But she gave specific details about this case to Sonny, who was the eldest of the children. She eventually managed to trace him and arrange a meeting with him. And that's what convinced him that she was his mother reincarnated, that and other details that he gave. And she was able to reunite the 5 children, who all actually lived fairly close together. I think a couple of them were in touch, but the other 3 weren't in touch, and she was able to reunite them all. So she felt that her mission was to reunite that family that had been separated when Mary had died. And again, there's no way she could have done that from just by chance, So that's a very compelling story. Another interesting bit to her story, which I didn't know until putting the book together, was that she also had another memory of being a 6-year-old boy who was run over by a milk float. And that was in like Middlesbrough or somewhere like that. And they were able to trace him as well. They were able to work out who he was run over when he was 6. Not all of the details. And then she had another past life memory of being somebody, I think, in Japan. And she remembered living in this house in Japan. And they weren't able to find the family, but they were able to find the house that she lived in from the details that she remembered. It's on the coast somewhere, I think. I think it was Japan, but it was somewhere in the Far East anyway. And the other interesting thing in one of her interviews was that she also had a future life sort of vision of living in, I think, Tibet in like 2040 or something, or 2030 as a future life there. So she's a very intuitive woman, and she was one that said that, a lot of people say, all these memories have come from hypnosis. People get hypnotized, or you think you've had a past life, let's hypnotize you then, and all these stories come out, and then people say, people are just confabulating hypnotic memories. No, in her case, she didn't have hypnotic regression for most of what she recalled. In fact, she said that the information she got from under hypnosis was not, as high quality as what she remembered, just with waiting for it to come into her mind through the natural order of things, So again, you start to stack these things up, that these people are accurate reporting on things that have happened long ago. And then you tie that together with things like the other thing I write about in one chapter is cellular memory. Does that mean anything to anybody?
Oh yeah, is that the one with Bruce Lipton? I know there's a.
He might write about. I don't quote him on this topic. But cellular memory is where you have an organ transplant, and then you pick up.
We were talking about that earlier, weren't we, Paul?
Paul
brought it up. Yeah.
So there's quite a few well-known cases of that where somebody will have like a liver transplant, and then they can remember certain things like I think there was one where somebody was killed in a motorbike accident, and they were the person that had the organ, the person that received the organ. I'm not sure if I've got this particular case in the book, but I've got others, because I couldn't find the reference for the one I'm just talking about now, but it's the one that's in my memory, where this woman, she had I think a liver transplant, and then after the liver transplant, she had, she wanted to eat crisps and cheese and onion crisps or something, and she'd never eaten these sorts of things before in her life. It was junk food to her, but apparently the donor, she found out later that when he was killed, he had a packet of cheese and onion crisps inside his jacket, and there were other things as well that she'd taken on the traits of this person who the organ donor. I think, let's see if I've got the text here and I can find it, because there's 2 or 3 cases in the book, and there's been scientific papers written about this as well, to sort of verify these things a bit more thoroughly.
I mean, I've read where people have, with these transplants, have gained languages from things like that. Even it's like, how does it? I mean, normal science, mainstream science, cannot really. They can't explain that, with their models,
No, that's right, and so I write about Rupert Sheldrake. I did briefly correspond with him, particularly about that topic, cellular memory. And he talks about morphic fields or morphogenetic fields, where he reckons that what happens is when there's an organism, it kind of generates this morphic field and imprints that on the sort of substrate of the universe or whatever.
Morphic resonance is a connection across time from the past to the present. And it's a process that occurs between organized patterns of activity on the basis of similarity. What it means, in effect, is that each species has a kind of collective memory. So every giraffe tunes in by morphic resonance to the form and to the behavior of previous giraffes. Every crystal, as it crystallizes, tunes in to the way that previous crystals of the same chemical crystallized in the past. So there's a kind of memory given by morphic resonance in all kinds of things. And in the realm of animal behavior, for example, it leads to quite striking predictions. If rats learn a new trick here in London, then rats all around the world should be able to learn the same trick quicker, just because the rats have learned it here. The more that learn it, the easier it should get everywhere else. And there's already evidence that this actually happens from studies of rats in laboratories. When lots of rats have learned something, other rats all around the world find it easier to learn. And this doesn't depend on any normal kind of connection between the different rats or the places. It happens because of morphic resonance on the basis of similarity.
And as he points out, and I mentioned this in the Richard D. Hall interview, I think one of the really basic questions anybody that's got a science background can look at this and think about it is, it's fairly well accepted what DNA does, in that it kind of dictates, your DNA dictates whether you're a human being or a dog or whatever, and the DNA dictates how your cells form. But what he points out is that no one says that DNA dictates your actual overall physical form. It might dictate that your cells have certain proteins in them, cells have certain functions, but as Richard, I think, put it, the skin cells on your hand are the same as the skin cells on your leg, and they have the same DNA. But your leg's your leg and your arm's your arm. They're different things, and they're oriented to one another relatively in a particular way. That is not coded in DNA, apparently. So the DNA codes for the bricks, but it doesn't have the design of the house. So where does the form come from of the creature? That's not encoded in the DNA, according to current theory. Because all these genetic diseases and stuff, they sort of treat. They're just targeting specific chains of protein, but they can't engineer your DNA to make you grow a third arm or something. That's not current. I don't think anyone will claim to do that. So that's really interesting, how he writes about that as well. And then going back to the cellular memory, I of course mentioned the quote that everyone talks about gut feelings, for example,
Yeah.
That's a common expression. But I think some of that comes from the fact that there are more nerve cells in your gut than in your brain. So can memories and feelings be stored in your gut as well as your brain? And there's some evidence for this, it's not generally accepted, but that I put that in the book as well. So yeah, I've put on like 3 or 4 cases of cellular memory. Case 3, murder mystery involving donor is solved by an organ recipient. An 8-year-old girl who received the heart of a murdered 10-year-old girl began having recurring vivid nightmares about the murder. Her mother arranged a consultation with a psychiatrist who, after several sessions, concluded that she was witnessing actual physical incidents. They decided to call the police, who used the detailed descriptions of the murder, the time, the weapon, the place, and the clothes he wore, what the little girl he killed had said to him, given by the little girl to find and convict the man in question. So that apparently was another real case. So, and that's not from a reincarnation, that's come from a girl that's had an organ donated to her. So work that one out, folks. It means that we're more than just our bodies. Our bodies,
absolutely,
are connected into something. Call it a consciousness field, call it the Akashic records, call it what you will.
I mean, it does seem like it's an aspect of the unified conscious field that's being tapped into in some way. Because I mean, the more I learn about these kind of things and how widespread these accounts are, and in neurology as well as in quantum physics and all, it's more that the model that the consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain seems so outdated.
Yeah. I mean,
we've known it for hundreds of years. We've known, in quantum physics, it's mad, that people still generally don't get it.
And I think, it's all tied in with, the other things we've talked about on Unite Planet, the sort of control grid and the global control system, particularly now, of course, being based around technology, that where with, everyone's kind of now being treated like cattle almost and have your barcode stamped on you. And we're not quite at that point yet, but sometimes particularly when you're going through an airport, it seems like we're at that point, doesn't it? That you've got your barcode, and if your barcode's not right, you're going to get chucked down the particular chute and end up on your arse somewhere, So this is kind of a counter to that, and I think a lot of the more formalized religions want to control you and explain what your nature is, rather than let you discover it for yourself. Whereas, I mean, there are other religions like Hinduism and Buddhism. They generally are more angled towards self-discovery and thinking about, what certain experiences mean, rather than trying to tell you to behave a certain way. I mean, that's one of the things I put in the book. If you look at religions generally, I think the way I look at them is they serve 2 main purposes, or they're meant to. One is to give you a moral code for living in a society or a group or a community, and the other is to tell you about God or some version of God or something. But really, those are they're kind of 2 separate things, really. And again, when I've learned a bit about Buddhism, and I've learned about these mindfulness teachings in Buddhism, which is how they're expressed in one branch of Buddhism, they're basically the same as the 10 Commandments. But we shouldn't confuse those things with the concept of God. We shouldn't confuse our behavior with what you might say God is, or our extended being, or how we can all communicate telepathically or whatever. Those things are the different things, and I think that's the mistake that a lot of people make, is that they think that religion is telling you how to live. Well, yes, it is, but it's not just that. It's meant to give you a concept for who you are as a being, or what you are as a being, and I think, when you look at all these other topics which are not really treated properly by science, that's when you start to see these other areas opening out and thinking, oh yeah, maybe there are other planets with life on, and then you think, well, what sort of consciousness might they have? Are they physical beings? Are there beings which are not really totally physical? And they, are there like angels and stuff? And it seems like, well, yes, there are. You can communicate with these other beings, and that's what people report in DMT experiences.
Yeah.
You know, they report communicating with beings that some of them look like the Greys, these grey aliens, and they people realise that these are real beings, you know, and they have their own lives, but you can only encounter them in this altered state of consciousness. And they even report, for example, you know, that you go into this altered state of consciousness, and you'll interact with these beings, and then you come back here, you know, and then the next time you have the DMT experience, you'll pick up where you left off. It's like they remember their previous interaction with you. So that discounts this idea of it being a simple hallucination, really.
If we look at it like frequency, so when you take psychedelics, or I mean, I've never tried it myself as of yet, it alters your consciousness state. But if you look at it from a frequency perspective, it just heightens your frequency, because we are energy. Like you say, we're a soul in a body, not a body in a soul. If we're emitting these frequencies, and you say some of these accounts that you've noted in your book, you know, at young ages, they're able to see things quite clearly. It's because their frequency hasn't been tampered with quite a lot. And then as they get older, you know, then they're molded. And then that's where religion, morals, teachings, you know, you're at that age, you're a sponge. And I love the idea that, you know, of what you said about children being like boys being called master. I mean, of course, they're in their purest form, aren't they? It's like you see babies and they've got no personality, brand new babies, and they're smiling and they're laughing. They're on a completely different frequency level to us. And so the question is then, how do we relate frequency into everyday life? How do we see frequency? Because often people don't believe things that they can't see.
Yes.
But frequency is more of a feeling, isn't it? It's like you say about the gut. Being in connection, in channeling, you know, with that frequency and everything out and above. How does that tie into your book? Like, how do you explain that to people that don't generally believe in such things or understand consciousness or frequency, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really try to explain that. I do point it out as a thing. You know, and talk about the skeptics. And I think people just get indoctrinated into science, you know, has all the answers. And many people, of course, as you all know from your own experience, they have a hand-to-mouth way of living. You know, they don't have time. You know, I mean, I've been lucky in life. You know, I've had enough work and I've had enough money, and you know, I haven't been sort of had to leave my home or anything. And so I've had time to think about these things, but some people just don't get that time. They don't have that luxury. So I think that's a block to this discovering that you are more than your physical body. And you know, and again, just in the rest of our society, we're discouraged from thinking that we are more than our physical body. Particularly, for example, all this gender thing that's been going on over the last 5 or 10 years, or however long it's been going, very disturbing. That people are, you know, even suggested that they should be questioning their own, what the gender is. I mean, that's just a you know, and I think I put in my book, what is the gender of the soul? I argue that the soul doesn't have a gender. It doesn't have, you know, it does not have a gender, and that's, I think people forget that. Well, that's I would argue that. I mean, obviously, you know, you have in Christianity things like, you know, Mother Mary, you know, Virgin Mary, but that's a whole, you know, then you got into esoteric interpretations of that if you want to. So nothing is that straightforward. But I think it's the religion which they try to say, well, yeah, you are your body, and you'll only not be your body when you die, and when you're not your body, that experience is dictated by what you are when you are your body, or what you do when you are your body. So people are programmed into some version of that thinking. I mean, not all religions are the same. But if you go again, the other area that I try and explore a bit, which I became aware of when I started to think more deeply about these things, and I'm going back 20 years now, really, is shamanism. And what the shamans did, and how each culture has its shamanic tradition. You know, even in Europe, like the Druids, and you would take these psychedelic substances, And then Terence McKenna, he came up with this, it was dubbed, I don't think it was his name, they called it the stoned ape theory. And that when these sort of lower forms of humans started ingesting psychedelic substances, that's what sparked their brains to start thinking and, and imagining. And that's when they started drawing pictures. And all the cave paintings were, done by these sort of stoned apes, as it were. I mean, I'm simplifying it greatly. Mm-hmm. And that's, and what I think was argued was that it was evolutionarily advantageous that because they'd had more highly developed brains, they could strategize more and they could say plan a hunt, what they were going to do better. So that's why we ended up with these higher functioning brains, just because it was evolutionarily advantageous. And of course you could still argue that, but other things don't seem to make sense from that perspective. Why would we enjoy music? Why would we make music, particularly now when we don't need to? And I talk a bit about music and the effect on consciousness as well. Some of that's quite personal taste that I express in that chapter, though. And so, yeah, the psychedelic substances one. What's the significance of that? And then you realise that, like the Roman Empire, they went and wiped out all the cultures that had shamanic practices, like the Druids. And there was one story, I think it was actually on this Time Team program, the Tony Robinson thing a few years ago, and they were digging up this Druid church or something on the Isle of Man or something, or it was either on the Isle of Man or the Isle of Anglesey. This is in the UK, and the Romans sent a legion from Londinium where to wipe out this last Druid culture that was practicing these shamanic, practices. They literally wanted them wiped out, because when you're doing self-exploration and self-realization, it's a threat to the authority of the church.
We still see that.
They don't have a purpose
today, don't we?
And you still see that today.
Because we're not really encouraged to be overtly imaginative or curious. No. And I mean, these things do felicitate those kind of thoughts. And they don't want that, and I think also with a lot of religion, it's or at least, the organized religion, it seems ego-based, like the whole worship aspect. Yeah. And we should be really moving away from that as faith.
And really you're encouraged to be in a state of fear. And I mean, of course, that was COVID through and through. I mean, what was COVID? Just absolutely. Stay in a state of fear, constant fear. Don't ever think that things are going to be, safe again, because they're not. Just stay in fear, and that's obviously Nim was talking about vibrations. It's always said that the fear state is the lower vibration, and
the frequency love is they want
higher.
Us on.
Yeah. And on that aspect as well, there's another bit I write about which appealed to my thinking a few years ago. This Tom Campbell guy who's I often get asked about
the Big Toe, is it
that's the one. That's the one.
Theory of everything. Yeah,
that's right. And I mean, I got through about 1.5 of his books. I think there's 3, and I got through about 1.5 of them, and they're a bit sort of heavy going in some places. But what I liked about what he said, and I said this in this original PowerPoint thing that I did, was that there's this thing called entropy, which is like the state, it's like the tendency of things to go into a more random state. Like if you have a cup that's nice and ordered, and got a teacup here, and then you just drop this on the ground, it'll smash to pieces. It becomes more random, and you can pick any other similar example. And that's what the universe is like. An asteroid crashes into another asteroid and it all breaks into a million pieces. And so as human beings, we're the opposite of that. Where the organizational force, or one of them, obviously life, I should say, life is the organizing force. It's the opposite of entropy. And so he was likening love to moving into a state of lower entropy. So that's when you get into this higher state. And fear, of course, is higher entropy. And he writes about that in his book. And I quite like that, because he was sort of joining together emotion and physics.
Okay, well, that in this virtual reality paradigm that I talk about, the larger consciousness system is the fundamental system. And we are avatars. We are played by a player that is a consciousness. I call that a individuated unit of consciousness. And that our virtual reality is here as a learning lab. You know about that, and that it's computed by a computer that's also part of the larger consciousness system, that the larger consciousness system is a information system, okay? Even a digital information system. Entropy is a measure of disorder. So think of an information system and how that applies to disorder. Well, information is order. If you have bits and the bits are all random, then there is no information. There's no information in randomness. That's almost the basic definition of randomness. No information in randomness. As those bits become ordered and that order has meaning, that order can be symbolic, that order could be just patterns. Any order contains information. For example, here's a very simple order. Up, down, up, down, up. What's next? Well, down would be next. Why? Because there's a pattern. We could predict what would happen next based on the pattern. That's information. There's information contained in the pattern. Okay, the pattern is lower entropy than if all those bits in the pattern were random. So you see, as bits are ordered, we create information, and those ordered bits can become symbols, like a 0 and a 1, you see, which could then produce lots of zeros and ones, which then can do everything a computer can do, just from those kinds of binary bits. So this is the nature of an information system, that it evolves to lower entropy, more order. It de-evolves to higher entropy. So an information system that is conscious, such as the larger consciousness system, then has two choices. It can evolve and grow and become more, creating more information, or it can de-evolve, have less information, less significance, and eventually, if that continues, die, end up with no information at all. So if you were a conscious, aware information system, what would you be doing? You would be trying to lower your entropy. So you see, the one that is ordered, the one that is caring, the one that is love-based, that is the low entropy solution to a social system. So that's what entropy has to do with love.
And there's one page where he talks about this experiment he did with a magnetic field, putting in a really strong magnetic field between, and he put his head in this thing they'd built. And it's ever so funny, really, because he said he spent weeks building this thing, and he switched on this magnetic field and made it stronger and stronger and stronger. And then he said at the end of it, he just had a headache. and there's no psychedelic effects. So I put in, you'll see it in the book, I had to steal a cartoon from Viz Comic, and it's Professor Piehead. I don't know if you've ever read Viz, but Professor Piehead always used to do these experiments, which, the one I put in, I think he's got this, acid bath repellent or something, or acid bath suit. I think he's made, and his pictures after he's stepped in this acid bath and all his legs have dissolved away and his upper body's all right, and he says another partial success, and that was the tagline. All his expressions were a total failure, really, but he described it as a partial success. But that Tom Campbell experiment reminded me of Professor Piehead, so I just put that cartoon in. So I'm hoping people will get a laugh out of that one. But yeah, he's got some quite good stuff to say. But again, and I'm sort of trying to follow a little thread here, I suppose you might say, because he's science, physics, consciousness, and he worked with Bob Monroe from the Monroe Institute. I'm sure you've heard of that.
Oh yes, yeah.
And I write a bit about the history of that in the book as well. But then it turns out, of course, that Tom Campbell worked on some of the US missile programs. I forget which one it was. See if I can find it in the book. So he's got big military contacts, and I think he was still involved in them for years. I think Campbell was, and so was the Monroe Institute. I mean, the Monroe Institute was contracted by the CIA and the military to do various experiments, and that's in some of the CIA documents that have been released. And then you get into the remote viewing with Joe McMoneagle and Pat Price. I've got a chapter on all of that. And and that gets overlooked, I think, a lot particularly by a lot of these new age groups, So let's see. Campbell, for 10 years, worked as an analyst with the Army Technical Intelligence, and then he worked on supportive defensive missile systems. He also worked with NASA. So he's heavily involved in the military. So he's talking about new age, well, not really new age stuff, but higher consciousness, yet he's involved with the military. And I kind of think, well, what's going on with that? I probably wouldn't want to do that, And I mean, I tell people the story that when I left university, I was offered a job at a company called GEC, the General Electric company, which is the British one. And they gave me a piece of paper, and that was going back to 1986 now, and they said, would you work on defence contracts? And I ticked no, and that was back in 1986. I've never wanted to work on I still wouldn't, I never did. I never went on to any defence work. And it's just something I never wanted to do. I just never wanted to work on defence stuff. Whereas some people seem to have no problem with that, and I don't know. You can make arguments both ways, I suppose. I don't want to be too moralistic, but that's just something which, I don't know, has been in my mind for a long time. I'm not quite sure. I'm just a pacifist, I suppose. There's nothing that converted me to that view that I can think of. I've just always been like that, and it just makes me uncomfortable when I have the few of these people talking about psychic beliefs and and then they're working for the military to do stuff. But hey, they could argue that they're working in defence, not offence. So maybe it's me that's just been a wimp, or something.
Oh, I wouldn't quite say that. I think being pro-life in any form is a really big part of being human. And in the world that we live in right now, we are having a human experience, but we're also it's quite nice to hear that, because it feels like both your human and your spirit side are in alignment with your beliefs and your feelings. So I wouldn't call yourself a wimp. Be kind to yourself, because that's not a nice thing to say.
Oh, wimp's all right. I think I don't mind calling myself a wimp, because I'm quite skinny and everything. So, but so there's stuff like that in there, and I think some of these books that you read, if, like, say you read Bruce Lipton's book, somebody like that, they won't talk about this stuff. They won't talk about 9/11 and how that sort of links into consciousness, and I mean, I can talk about that. I think we've talked about that, what I'm mentioning that, and I probably talk more about that in my 9/11 book, 9/11 Holding the Truth. But with something like 9/11, and you could say it's the same for COVID, really, it's like a gateway. It's like a gateway for your consciousness to go through as a person when you're finding out about it. And so you go into something like 9/11 and you think, oh my God, it was horrible, and all those people were killed, and and everything, and you just think, well, it was Islamic terrorists, and they must be horrible people, and blah blah blah. But then if you start to study it and you realize, no, it wasn't them, and somebody did something here. And then as you and I've had many conversations, I know, on Unite Planet and probably outside of that too, it wasn't that at all. And in fact, what happened was it was an advanced weapon system that destroyed the towers. And that's not a theory. People want to call it a theory, both mainstream scientists and the media and everything, and most of the quote unquote truth movement. But it was, and so my investigation of that was like a spiritual journey. So initially I was terrified. I thought when 9/11 happened, I thought there was going to be another war. And I thought, what's America going to do? Are they going to send all nukes out and blow everything up? I was really scared for a couple of days. But then after about 18 months, when I'd sort of calmed down a bit and nothing much seemed to have happened, at least not here, I started to investigate it, and it opened up this whole new sort of arena of understanding, really. And so I didn't get put off by the fear. I did for a bit, but then that went away, and I started to look into all these other areas. And it's same with COVID. You could think, this COVID virus is going to kill us all, and then they've got these jabs, people are dropping dead from these jabs, or you can find out what's behind it, and then you find out about all this other stuff, and I mentioned COVID obviously a few times in the book as well, and how that was just a scam and a fear-based operation, So it's fear or love,
Yeah.
which way you're going to go ultimately, and that's what a lot of people say, and I agree with that.
It's like the Bill Hicks quote, isn't it? What are you going to choose between love and fear?
Yeah, that's right. And build bigger walls around your house or whatever, or And I mentioned the Bill Hicks quote at the end as well, because that seemed to be very near the end, and and quote that, because I think that's great. That you just said, we are basically energy condensed down into matter, and we're just trying to. We are the imagination of ourselves, and the imagination is very important as well.
Saying all this stuff, and he died quite soon after, didn't he?
Well, he did, yeah. And then I do mention that there's this whole conspiracy that he's really Alex Jones or the other way around.
Yeah.
And it is weird. That is weird, Richard, when I mentioned that to Richard, and he was like laughing. He didn't want to. He thought it was ridiculous, But no, you should look at some of the evidence. There's something going on there, and even Alex Jones has said this, So it's not to rule anything out, and it frustrates me that a lot of these people could explore some of this territory that I've put into this book, and they never do. They just don't, and that's kind of one of the reasons for me creating it, because I wanted to do it. It took me a while. It took me, because I think maybe like yourselves, when COVID happened, I got a bit fed up really, because I thought, well, just maybe we'd done enough. We'd made enough people think there's more stuff going on, folks. It's not what they tell you. And then you think you've just done enough maybe to like stop people from going down the same route they did with 9/11. And then it happened on a massive scale.
Yeah.
And we had families breaking up and everything. And I think after that, I just thought, well, what's the point? Why have I even done it? Why have I wasted it? And, that's a very sort of negative view. I didn't think that all the time. But it's very frustrating when you think, oh, yeah, I might have made a difference. And then you think, no, I haven't. After being involved with it for 10, 15, however many years it was. But so it took me a while to kind of get over that and say, well, let's get this done, because I started writing that started compiling it in 2019. So it took me over 6 years to kind of finally put it out there, So.
And it's the whole thing, isn't it? That again, it goes back to them wanting to keep us in fear.
Yeah.
And it's very obvious that for me, I'm sure to you as well. I think we've spoke about this even, that the controllers of the earth, they understand all of this.
Oh yeah.
And so they can acclimatize whatever they need to do to contain us and keep us away from basically being more aware than we can be. And
exactly.
Because of course, because fear is a very restrictive thing, you keep people in fear, and you just on automatic response then on survival, and then they give you the answer to survival that you need. It's all, it's all, you can see the planning in it. Sometimes.
Yeah. And I mean, 2 chapters in the book, one I've called The Power of Positive Thinking and one of The Power of Negative Thinking. And I think so many books would include the first chapter, but not the second. And I think it's important to have that second chapter, and look at what they do, what's being done, and I go a little bit into the numerology and symbolism and whatnot, and stuff like that. And a lot of these sort of more new agey type books, maybe I shouldn't use that term, but everyone knows what I mean by that. They just exclude all of that.
Yeah.
And I think I think you've got to have a balanced picture.
Yeah.
Accentuate the positive, of course, yes, but don't just say the negative doesn't exist, or let's not talk about that.
And that's the thing. It's about being, again, open and curious. And we're kind of like we said before, we're encouraged not to be like that. And people even defend that. They're in that much of that frequency, that state, that they'll even defend that position. And almost ridicule anyone who is curious and open about topics like this.
That's right.
Or even fearful because you're going down the path of discussing things about death, and people are a bit uncomfortable about that.
Yeah, that's
but
true.
as we were talking before, when you actually get in exploring it, the fear isn't there. It's beautiful, in fact. There's because a lot more things open up, and it'll open up our own frequency. Just starting to understand this, what it does to our own frequency. So
yeah,
And I always think, imagine a world where we're all like that. What a different world this would be.
Totally.
You know,
totally.
Because it goes into, you know, creating our own reality.
Yeah.
And I think that plays into it as well.
It does. I mean, I talk about that in those chapters, you know, a positive thinking can create a positive reality, and a negative thinking creates a negative reality. It's as simple as that, really.
Yeah,
you know? But, well, not as simple as that, but, you know, that's the basis of it. And I do mention that in a couple of chapters deliberately for that reason.
It is. I mean, we've touched on about consciousness. When you think it's everything, really. When you look into it, it's the whole thing. It's what everything is. You know,
well, maybe I'll finish with the start of the book, because I got this quote I came across this quote from a well-known physicist, Max Planck.
Oh yes,
you know, and he's responsible for Planck's constant and the Planck length. And he says, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. And that was said in The Observer, 25th January 1931.
That's it, yeah. I mean,
so very well.
That's how long, though, they've been studying this, you know, and it's been open. I mean, like the double split experiment.
I put that in as well, double split experiment,
I mean, that was first done, I don't know how many years ago, but
I think in the early 19th century, I can't remember the exact date, but Young slits experiment, we did that at school, in physics,
I mean, that says so much as well. You know, it's just incredible. I'm just aware of time. So how should we wrap this up? What's the good way to end this, do you think?
Well, I could read I always like to say, like the Bill Hicks quote. I mean, it's better when he does it. I can't do it as well as him, of course, but I can try and get that. I mean, I've got several quotes at the end, but let me just get the Bill Hicks quote, because I do like it. The one about where he talks about matter, you know, being we're all sort of condensed, sort of. Let's see, where are we? Let me get it. Today, a young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There's no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we are the imagination of ourselves. So, I think that was. I know he came up with that.
It sums it all up, doesn't it?
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So, that's a great place to end, and I hope we can expand on this in another show, because there's so much to cover. And I mean, really, we've only just covered little bits of it all. So there's a lot more to go. So it's been great, Andrew. Thanks for being our first guest. It's been great, and we'll look forward to the next time as well.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
For coming.
Yeah, it's been great. So thanks again, Andrew, and we will see you next time.
Today, a young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we're the imagination of ourselves. Here's Tom with the weather.